Well, good afternoon, evening, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Lori Starr, and we have the technological wizard here, Adrienne Todella, from the core group. Adrienne?
Good morning from DC. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We're pleased to have you here with us today. Just a couple of things before I'll give it back to Lori, just a couple of housekeeping things. We are not providing microphone rights for today's session, so please go ahead, and if you have any comments or questions at all throughout this webinar, if you can type it up on the chat box on your screen, and we'll be sure to bring it up throughout as we go through the session. This session is also being recorded, so you will receive a copy of the recording and the presentation and all the relevant materials afterwards. And it will also be up on our FSN Network website. And again, if you have any questions at all for any tech issues, just comment on the chat box and we'll be sure to help you. And now I'm going to turn it back to Lori.
Okay, again, we're so pleased to have folks on the line. It looks like we're trickling in a little slowly today, but we expect to have many time zones participating. We know it's probably most convenient for those of you in Africa and fairly late for our Asian colleagues. So Rafik, I see you there. Thanks for joining. And it's quite early for folks here in the U.S. and particularly some folks who expect to join who aren't in Eastern time zone. So anyway, thanks to everyone for trying to come together at a time that worked for many, many different zones. You'll see over in the right, the left lower corner of your screen, there are some files to download. One is the Theory of Change checklist. Again, this session today is based entirely on understanding aspects of that checklist. You also have a Theory of Change refresher agenda, and I think at some point soon there will be the M&E policy and guidance document that'll show up in a moment. So please download the Theory of Change checklist and keep it on hand. We will be referencing the list throughout this session. I thought this was fascinating. As you know, we asked for your very specific questions in order to design this session. So we didn't start out saying, oh, this is what we think people need to know. We said, what do you want to know? And I categorized all of the questions that came in from the 4 sessions. It was over, gosh, it was close to 118 now. And we saw that there were some themes that many people would like more information about, particularly assumptions, cross-cutting themes in a TOC, formatting, and the Theory of Change narrative. We will try to address every single question that you posed in the time available. What we won't be able to address are some of the areas that are outside the scope of this event. For example, we had a number of questions you'll see in the olive green slice on monitoring and modifying the Theory of Change. This is of high interest to many folks, and there will be some more workshops to follow that will focus on the annual review, the TOC annual review, as well as monitoring and modifying the Theory of Change. But that's a little bit outside the scope of this event. Similarly, the log frame transfer is outside the scope of the event. We're trying to nail down these items on the checklist. For some of you who may not be familiar with where did this checklist come from, and what's its purpose? This sprang from a need to have some guidelines that you could follow as PVOs, those of you developing theories of change, those of you reviewing them for your organization, as well as the Food for Peace reviewers. We wanted a common list that people could use when they're trying to determine the quality and the thoroughness of the diagrams and the theory of change narrative. So out of curiosity, how many of you on the line have used the TOC checklist to check the quality and thoroughness of your DFSA theory of change? You could just type a quick yes or no. Or yeah, Rose is raising her hand. All right. So yeah, just a quick yeah. Okay, good. Well, it's been out about a year, so it's good to know that people are aware of it and that people are using it. I'm going to move to the next slide, and you'll see when I eliminated the topics that were outside the scope of this event, we really see that the narrative, the formatting, the cross-cutting themes and assumptions, those questions you posed, they're about 2/3 of all questions. So it's a key to me that we need to enhance the guidance out there, and we need to provide some more webinars to explore these issues. A little reminder here that the checklist, while it is a common tool for Food for Peace reviewers and for you to use to check the quality and thoroughness, it is not the tool that explains how to do everything. Where do we get that information? If you want to know what Food for Peace expects specifically, where is that information located? You can type your answers in the checkbox, in the chat box, sorry. Hurrah! Rodwell gets the piece of virtual chocolate. The Food for Peace M&E policy and guidance document is the Bible on this. The checklist is simply a tool to help you go through the requirements and say, did we hit all of the requests that are stated in the Food for Peace M&E policy and guidance document? The TOPS guidance, which is on the FSN network, supplements the M&E policy and guidance document by providing some more explanation about how to complete these expectations and providing a lot of examples. And I'm continually refining the TOPS theory of change curriculum to ensure it stays up to date with Food for Peace guidance. So keep checking in. If you've used the TOPS curriculum last year, make sure you've got the most, each time you want information on theory of change, make sure you go to the FSN and grab the latest copy. That's also true for the theory of change checklist. It continually evolves, and that was its purpose from the beginning, that as we are able to refine this list, making it as clear as possible, we're going to publish a new version, okay? And I'll tell you this time around, your input and your questions were key to helping to refine this list. We had a long meeting with the majority of the Food for Peace M&E team on Monday, and because of your questions and your input, we were able to make a number of clarifications. And what I want to be clear about is we did not change the criteria, we just changed the language in the list so that hopefully it's more clear to you. And today I'm going to point out some of the areas that have slightly changed just so you're aware as you move forward. One big change is just the title of the TOC narrative. So today you'll hear me refer to complementary documentation / TOC narrative. It's sort of like Prince. Do you guys know the artist formerly known as Prince? Right? This is the complementary documentation formerly known as the TOC narrative. The reason for this change is that Food for Peace does not want a narrative. doesn't want a story. It doesn't want, 20 pages of you telling the story of change. It wants a lot of complementary documentation in the form of evidence on your assumptions and supporting links, web links and references for your rationales and so forth. So that's a big change, and again, nothing changed in the requirements of the narrative. It's just the title, so that it doesn't throw us off when we say, okay, turn in your narrative, and when I hear that, I want to write a story. So again, don't fret. Nothing changed about the criteria. The criteria in the M&E policy and guidance is exactly the same. We're just calling it a complementary documentation because it's a better name for what it is. So with that intro, we're going to move on to answering your questions. Now you'll see that we will not address every single item on this checklist because you didn't ask questions. There are some things you are not confused about. For the most part, I'm going to move through the checklist in order when it makes sense to do so. And I'll let you know which checklist item we're on. And that's why it's important for you, if you can keep that checklist near you, if it's downloaded, printed out, and so forth, just keep it near you so you are aware of what we're referencing. Okay to go? Are any questions about how we'll proceed through the webinar? Seems like we're okay to go. Great. Good. I like this. Rodwell's the leader here. He keeps chiming in. That's greatly appreciated. There were just a few questions about items 2A and 2B on the checklist, outputs and outcomes. You asked, key outputs from interventions could be an exhaustive list. Can this be avoided on the theory of change document? You also asked, should M&E or how the expected outcomes be measured be part of the theory of change? And I'm going to quickly explain that the little r there means the question came from the remote session. This came from your group. So sometimes you'll see a 1, a 2, a 3, and there were some pretty relevant, I think, and good questions coming from the other group, and I did leave some of those in. So if you're just wondering what that R means. So let's look at that first question. It could be an exhaustive list. Yes, it could be. And this is one change that's happened. This didn't happen, well, it happened near the start of the year. The former checklist used to ask you to include every single output from an intervention that is promised in the award document, including one-off assessments, formative studies, and events. That is no longer a requirement. We want you to be selective. We want to see the top-level outputs that are necessary to achieve an outcome. So we don't need to see the formative study that's used to develop training tools. What you want to demonstrate is sustainability, and I'll get to that later in the webinar. It was a question of a number of you. But when you're trying to determine which outputs to present, get to the top-level ones that are absolutely necessary and sufficient to achieve whatever outcome they intend to achieve. Now, I will say this about including, that guidance is for your proposals. Once you're awarded, I think it can be very beneficial once you're to the state where you have your theory of change and you want to blow it up on the wall and you really start to use it as a motivational tool for your team and as something to guide implementation and adaptive management decisions. You very well may want to get more of those outputs in your diagram. That's up to you, and you'll work with your own Food for Peace M&E person, but they're not, every single output is not required. So I hope that answers the first question. Yes, it could be an exhaustive list, and that exhaustive list belongs in the dip. So be selective and get those top-level outputs in your diagram. What we do want to make sure that you do is you get some outputs in the diagram, because many diagrams have been coming in the past without any outputs. The second question there, should M&E or how they'll be measured be part of the theory of change diagram? It is not, these do not have to show up in the diagram, right? It is extremely important to be able to measure the outcome progress, but we won't see that in your diagram. That'll show up in your log frame, right, which they're complementary tools. And it's essential that we know how you're monitoring each outcome, but we don't need to see the M&E in the diagram that's turned into Food for Peace. Here's another question. Summarizing, let's see, I noticed there's no inputs level. Why? It's important to show the consistent flow of what leads to what. Or will just the output be presented, such as competent use of agricultural inputs and skills? It is very, very important to know what will start change in motion, right? What are you doing as an organization? You're the grease that starts this change in motion. So yes, it's very important to include your outputs. Now I think here we're just having a different interpretation of output, because I would say competent use of agricultural inputs and skills is an outcome, right? People have changed their behavior, and so that's an outcome we're looking for. But the point this person is making is we definitely need to see what are you doing as an organization? What are the results of your intervention, these measurable results that will start the change in motion? So if we see, I'm trying to get an example from this question, but we'll see some more examples throughout the session. But, something might be youth are trained on a particular vocational skill, or material provided to build toilets, right? Or community health volunteers trained on XYZ. So the outputs definitely need to show up in your theory of change model. That's the start of everything, right? That's the action point. Here's I guess I had inserted a slide here. If we can look toward the bottom, right, we see sanitation products and services mapped and service providers trained, care group leaders trained and assisted to form groups, community clinic staff trained in CMAM, GMP, IMCI. If you notice, all of these statements are in a result form, right? They are stated as completed states of being. It's done, and we expect that those outputs are necessary and sufficient to achieve the outcome they're leading to. You might get sick of me talking. That's the problem with no microphone, right? But we'll open it up now for any other questions. There weren't too many on outputs and outcomes, but anything still a little bit muddy? Isn't a high-level output and a lower-level outcome similar and subjective? I see outputs and outcomes as quite distinct. And I'm not sure, maybe Rodwell, I don't know that I think there's a lot of different interpretations of what output and outcomes, you know, how they're described by different donors and by different organizations. I'm not sure what your organization internally, how you differentiate between outputs and outcomes. For the theory of change, the outputs that are expected are the results of your interventions. Like what happens when your interventions are complete, not the behavior change, right, not the increased access to something, but what is the completed state of your intervention? And I don't know that I can provide more detail right now, but I'll look into it and maybe chat with you later about why, you know why this might be true for your organization or for within Food for Peace. I'm not sure. I haven't seen any literature to say that a high-level output and a lower-level outcome are similar. Okay, but we'll look into it, and we certainly can chat more. So let's dig into assumptions, because as you can see, 20% of all questions across all groups were related to assumptions. We're going to ask you to take a quick little poll here so that we understand where this group sits on assumptions. First, we want to understand, the extent to which you agree with the statement on the lower left of the screen. If you could take that poll. Do you think you have a good understanding of Food for Peace expectations? And that's the key word here, right? What does Food for Peace expect related to assumptions in a theory of change? Okay, and then if you could move to the poll to the right of that one, and we're just going to ask you your opinion. There are several assumptions on the screen. Do you think any of these are good assumptions? Do you think all of them? There's also an all of the above, and there's a none of the above choice. So if you could take that poll. Okay, we have most people chiming in right now. So anybody who said none, you get a gold badge, and you could probably be leading this discussion. And my apologies, it's kind of a trick question. If you cited any of these as acceptable assumptions, don't worry, you're not alone. And a lot of people consider them to be assumptions, and they actually are internal assumptions to your project, things that you're in control of and you need to monitor, but they're not the type that Food for Peace wants depicted in the theory of change diagram. And that's precisely what we hope to clarify today. These are internal assumptions related to implementation, right? But they are within your control. So we're going to learn a bit about this right now. Here were some of the questions you posed. How do we define appropriate and relevant assumptions? Another group asked, could more specific guidance or examples be included in the checklist? I just want to drive the point home that that will not be provided in the checklist, right? But where you find more specific guidance is one, in the Bible, the Food for Peace, M&E Policy and Guidance document, And you can also go to the TOPS curriculum to get more examples. And the TOPS will be creating more and more examples so that you get an idea of this. But the guidance, the checklist is a summary of the guidance. The guidance you want to use when you're trying to figure all this out is Food for Peace and the new policy and guidance document. So we're going to start first here with the types of assumptions Food for Peace wants to see in your theory of change, and then we'll move into how to document them in the diagram, and then how to back them up with evidence that belongs in the complementary documentation that we formally call the narrative. What Food for Peace wants to see is, it's called an external assumption. And these are conditions that are very important to the success, and I will stress that word, the success of a theory of change, the success of a pathway, the success of achieving a particular outcome, but they are outside of your control, right? They're outside of the activity's control. We have some contextual factors and political factors, economic factors listed on the screen. I'll let you read those rather than reading them out loud. What we want to avoid is, there's some types of conditions, I'd say, that are routine. Let's say flooding or shock, right? Some other shock. That's routine. And so, yes, we do assume it's going to happen during the life of the activity, but we won't be listing that as an assumption, right? This is a problematic condition. It is a contextual condition you've got to consider in your project design. It's a risk to the project. So we focus on the word success, right? Something that, a condition that's already in place. It's important it remains in place, and it's going to contribute to the success of a pathway. And most importantly, it's out of your control. The little note at the bottom says Food for Peace does not expect partners to add internal assumptions to the theory of change. These often crop up. We see them all the time. Assumptions such as the ones in the trick question earlier. I know a lot of the literature out there on theory of change, Act Knowledge publications, Annie Casey Foundation, Center for Theory of Change, a lot of the really good literature on theory of change out there talks about these kinds of internal assumptions, and I think that might be why there's been a little bit of confusion. But these, again, we're shifting to the screen here. The types of assumptions on the screen are all internal. Men and women will take investment risk. Men and women will be open to new practices. Husbands will allow wives to attend VSLA meetings. Yes, we are going to assume that our efforts to convince people, right, that will convince husbands to let their wives attend these VSLA meetings. We assume our effort will be successful because they've been successful in past similar contexts. So these are very important to monitor. They're an essential part of good project management, but these are under your control, right? These rest on the success of your project intervention, and if they're not holding, you need to change your implementation. So we're going to be very clear. These type of assumptions should not show up in the theory of change diagram, even though you'll be monitoring them as part of good project management. Here's another one, right? Income earning potential is sufficient to sustain participants' engagement with the value chain actors. Well, if you make this assumption, I mean, you may have a very good reason for making this assumption because you've got data from market studies. You know that the income earning potential of ground nut production is going to be sufficient to keep people engaged. So you make this, again, internal assumption that it'll remain true. And you decide, yeah, we're going to promote ground nuts. But you've got to continue to monitor whether that income is actually sufficient to keep farmers engaged, right? If it's not, you've got to reevaluate your intervention and understand why isn't it sufficient. Maybe you'll make some changes based on this review. Again, essential part of project management, and because it's within project control, Food for Peace does not want this type of internal implementation assumption to be in the theory of change diagram. Another one, very common type of assumption that crops up, an assumption, I guess, internal assumption that comes in with the theory of change diagrams that shouldn't be there. Community decision-making bodies will not prevent youth and women from actively participating. Yes, you might assume, based on your past experience and your formative research, that your strategy will be successful, right? And it'll be successful in this new context. Again, you've got to monitor it. You've got to monitor these decision-making bodies. How accepting are they of youth and women? If there's problems, you reevaluate your strategy and you change your implementation. Good project management, again, but not a type of implementation assumption that Food for Peace wants to see in your theory of change diagram. Does that clear up some of the questions related to assumptions? I've got some other, this is a main type that crops up that Food for Peace does not want to see in the diagrams, and then I have a few more examples. But for right now, are there any questions about what I've just presented? Okay, we'll keep an eye on the chat box and just move along, and if a question pops up, we'll address it. Some I see frequently, I call them magic wand assumptions or hope and a prayer. These are assumptions that aren't backed up by any evidence. Now, they might be valid if there was evidence to support them, but these are things that, you know, they just crop up and we hope the government will commit human resources, or we haven't done our research. We are going to, you know, promote increased production, but we don't really know what kind of post-harvest storage facilities exist. You need to get the evidence. And this we'll talk more about. It shows up in the complementary documentation / narrative. Figure out, will the government commit those resources? Figure it out. Do these storage facilities exist? You can change your language to better reflect that this is a condition that's already in place and you expect it to remain in place. It could be better phrased by saying the government continues to commit human resources, or these storage facilities remain in place. And then again, we're going to back it up in the narrative, and I'll show you how to do that momentarily. Here's another one. Often we see assumptions that just plain aren't true, right? Don't put something in that the data show to be untrue. We see flooding and drought will not impact agricultural production. Well, that's a hope and a prayer too, right? Particularly if the data show continual drought in the region, or that floodings occurred in 2 of the 3 past years. So your assumptions need to be backed up with some data. And if they're not true, there's no way you can make it true. Again, we will program in the context of continual drought. The types of interventions we choose will be different if we're working in an area where flooding is very common, or where cross-border conflict is common. So let's move along, and we're going to ask you to give us some feedback here, right? There's 3 questions, and we want to understand, oops, I can't see the top poll, but what assumption, which of these assumptions, right, you can choose as many as are applicable. Which assumptions do not meet Food for Peace criteria? I'm going to check all that apply. Which assumptions are kind of risky as worded, right? We're not too sure about them. And which what type of evidence is needed to support some of these risky assumptions? What would make them stronger? So good, I see some folks checking in. Now this is my fault. I took the number out, so I can't really tell how many of you have answered, but we'll just give it a moment. And again, which assumptions do not meet the food for peace criteria that we've discussed? Okay, so those of you who said number 3 does not meet the criteria we discussed, bravo, absolutely. It does not. Why not? Can you type a quick, or there is no chat box right now, but we'll talk about that in a minute. It absolutely does not meet the food for peace criteria, right? Because it's under your project control. If people aren't motivated, you need to change how you're going about your intervention so that the farmers are motivated. Okay, which assumptions are risky as worded? Well, I want to hear from you in a moment, right? 1 and 2. We have, some folks are saying 4. Okay, and anybody piping up on some of the evidence we need to support the risky assumptions? Okay, well, I agree. I think 2 and 4 are risky as worded. If we look at number 2, there's plenty of evidence to show this is more likely to be a risk to female-headed household adoption. Now, in some contexts, it could be true, but it certainly needs to have some evidence to back it up, right? Otherwise, it's a hope and a prayer. So this type of assumption would need to be substantially backed up with evidence, and I'd recommend changing the wording to indicate that we know this is true, even though it's a less common circumstance. We know that it's true, and we have a reason to believe it'll remain true. Number 4, again, that needs to be supported with evidence, right? That there are alternative farming lands available. If they're not available, we're in for trouble. That's a pretty risky assumption, right? If there's some evidence to support the statement, that would be a good assumption. The wording could slightly change to reflect that the condition's already in place. Perhaps something like alternative farming lands remain available and accessible to male and female small farmers. Number 1, I didn't cite it as risky, but I can see how somebody might. That one too, as long as trend data support it, I think it's worded fairly well, but you absolutely need some trend data to support it in the complementary documentation. Does anyone want to chime in? We don't have a chat box on this slide, but when we move forward, if anyone would like to comment on why they felt number 1 was risky as worded, it would be great to get your input. Can we do that? Can we move forward to just, okay. Yeah, we can go back to where we have a chat box, and those of you who felt number 1 was risky as worded, let's understand why. Okay, well, maybe not. How about evidence? Did we get any answers there on? And nobody responded to what kind of evidence would support. Okay, well, let's think about it. If we needed to support alternative farming lands are available, right? We'd have some kind of data. We've done some formative research in the area, and we recognize that there are other places to farm, maybe communal lands, or some such thing where people can get off these marginal lands. They can allow them to recover. There's somewhere else that people can farm. And we've had some data to support it, and we continue looking into this during the early parts of the project. As far as supporting, I talked already about the evidence to support the female-headed households. That's less common, but if you had done some formative research or you had a project in that area, you're coming out of a 5-year project, and you knew that even though this is more often the norm, in your case it's not true, and female farmers, female-headed households do have plentiful labor. Maybe there's a really strong social structure. There's a lot of social capital, and the way people move about their business is helping each other out and trading off labor. It could be entirely possible, and that's the kind of evidence that might help support that statement. Let's see, we get any comments there? Can you go down so I can see? Oh, okay. If we know number 2 is true, would we still call it an assumption? Yes, I think I just answered that, Rodwell, right? If you have some evidence, again, the key word, you have something to back it up. Yes, you could call it an assumption, that they'll continue to have. Female-headed households will continue to have sufficient labor available because, in the example I use, this social structure hasn't changed in the last, 80 years. This is the way the community works as far as sharing labor. Yes, you could call it. I'm going to let Adrienne address the technical issue. And Adrienne, would you be able to, I know you're multitasking, could we move forward to the next slide, and then I can keep going. There were some questions from the group. Would you also count project staff transition in point number 2C? I'm going to ask you to answer. I've got an answer, right? But what do you think? Is project staff transition considered an acceptable assumption for a Food for Peace DFSA theory of change? Yes, Rose, absolutely. That's something internal. You might know that you've got a, you always have transition, so yes, you can assume it's going to be true, but and it may, to some extent, you may feel like it's not under your control, but it is. I mean, you can change, I don't know, organizational policy. It's not an external assumption that Food for Peace wants to see in the diagram. It's internal. The second question, how do I ensure my theory of change plugs every loophole of possible assumptions that may not hold? It's impossible, right? And it's not expected. You do the best that you can, and we want to think of critical assumptions. Again, we're not looking for an assumption to be listed between every single causal linkage. We want you to do due diligence. We want to see that you have a really good understanding of the context and the things that you know are in place and you expect to remain in place. But I don't think anybody expects every single loophole of possible assumptions to come up. That's why we review and modify these diagrams. That's why we go through a thought process to say, which of these assumptions are holding, which aren't? Oh, do we have some new assumptions? We've been working here a couple of years. What do we know now? What condition is in place that's critical to achievement that we might want to include? That's all about reviewing and modifying and rethinking our development hypothesis, which is the theory of change. And that's the beauty of theories of change, I think, compared to a results framework. We want them to change. We expect them to change. It shows we're paying attention to the context. Here are some questions, and I'd love to learn from you other questions that you've used to help identify assumptions. I typically just start with the basic. Okay, what condition critical to achieving a particular outcome or a whole pathway? What is already in place, and what do I expect to remain in place for the life of the activity? Then I start thinking about, okay, I've been here a while. I've been working in this country for, 4 years now. Am I taking anything for granted related to the political, environmental, or social context? What's in place that's really critical to the success of my project that I might be taking for granted? Is it something about other stakeholders and their capacities? And there's there's some great literature on that, and I'll share it. I'm sorry I did not make it available for download, but I will share it with you via your emails later and follow up. Once you start brainstorming this with a diverse team, you definitely want to make sure you've got some evidence. If I'm making an assumption, do I have some evidence to convince me that this condition is going to remain in place through the life of the activity? And that's the type of information that piece wants to see in the complementary documentation / narrative. So before we move into how to document assumptions in your diagram, are there any other questions? Okay, then I think I'll move ahead and we'll keep our eye on the chat box. A couple of you out there said, could you please elaborate, how do you incorporate these? How do you visually represent them? How do we make them get out of the way, so they're not in the way of the rest of the pathways? I'll talk about that briefly right now. The Food for Peace M&E Policy and Guidance document asks you to use a unique shape and color to highlight conditions outside of the project's influence. In this diagram, they're the circles with the point, heading in, the pest infestation, right? Make it pop. Make it look different from your outputs and outcomes so that when a reader or a reviewer picks it up, they can instantly see what is an assumption, and you'll identify whatever shape you use. There's no set shape. Whatever you choose to use, you'll identify that in the required key that's on every single page of your diagram. Another important piece about incorporating it is make sure it links to a theory of change element, right? We need to know what part of the story of change it relates to. Occasionally, there are some assumptions that kind of float and affect an entire theory of change, but this is a personal opinion. I typically find those pretty vapid. They're kind of, if you've got an assumption that's so big it affects the entire thing, I think I won't say much more. But the guidance says that is acceptable. But really think about it. Is that a critical assumption? If it's so critical, it's going to undermine your entire theory of change. You may want to question whether you're programming in that area. For the most part, I think assumptions need to link to the part of the story of change that they're related to. In this case, the pest infestation it's critical for increased crop production. We might improve soil fertility, and the two other outcomes that we can see, their little lines feeding into that diagram. We might achieve all three things, but we need pest infestation to remain within normal limits, or we will not see that crop production. So it's critical to achieving that outcome. If there's not room, like if you don't have room for a bubble with all of the words, you can put a little identifier in there. You see the two at the bottom, A2 and A3. Again, those identifiers link to the complementary documentation. It needs to be very easy for the reviewers and other users to find, well, if I want to know what this assumption is, I want to be able to find it quickly. I want to know where to go in the narrative to find that assumption, to find the documentation backing it up. From a decade of experience coaching folks on theories of change, if you have room to state the full assumption, I'd say do it. And this does not relate to Food for Peace requirements. This is to get your country teams to use it. And again, that's our main goal. We want the theory of change to be a useful tool that motivates people, that they're checking in with, they're understanding, how am I progressing on this theory of change? Are things happening the way I thought they would? And if you want people to really use it, it's very helpful to have these critical assumptions spelled out in your diagram because they're a critical precondition. You're making an assertion that this is so critical, I don't think this outcome can be achieved unless the assumption holds. And when we're telling the story of change, and by that I mean if we improve soil fertility and we do whatever else is leading into crop production and pest infestation remains within normal limits, right? That's the story of change. Then we expect to see increased crop production. If you don't have the words in the bubble, it's hard for your field teams to tell that story. It's hard for them to jump to another document and say, what's A1? What assumption am I expecting to hold? We pay less attention to our assumptions if they're not called out in a diagram. So, while it is, per the guidance, it's acceptable to put a little reference point if things are getting too clunky and, pathways are hard to read. It's entirely acceptable. But if you can put the words in, do it, because your teams will be more likely to use your diagrams if those words are there to help them read the story of change. So now there's two types of information that transfers to the assumptions column in the log frame. The first we've been talking about now for quite some time, for 40 minutes or so, these external assumptions. The second type of information that transfers to the assumption column is whether or not these external actors will achieve their particular outcomes or outputs. We're relying on them to achieve that outcome, right? It's a critical precondition that, in this case, the Ministry of Labor increase access to information on safe migration. If we are trying to promote safe and profitable employment in a context where many, many people must rely on migration and remittances, that is, to make it safe, it's critical that Ministry of Labor achieve this outcome. So we assume they will, and that will transfer. This comes right out of M&E policy and guidance document. That transfers to the log frame. It's not the external actor is not the assumption, but our expectation that they'll achieve their work is an assumption. Are there questions about that? We can see the two types, right? The external assumptions we have highlighted in red. These are examples coming from policy and guidance documents. Right, we've got Ministry of Health maintains adequate MC&H health service personnel. We've got no outbreak of disease. But then we have external health and WASH objectives in the area are achieved. Now, this is pretty general, and it's a pretty general statement. I think it's more effective and more helpful to your team if we go back a slide, please. If we list the specific actor on, for example, in this case, on the outcome line in the log frame related to increased, safe, and profitable employment, I would list that assumption in that same row, the assumption that the Ministry of Labor will achieve their outcome related to increased access to information. I think it's more specific. If we want people to use these documents, it's less general than just lumping all of the external actors in one area. But I just wanted to clarify that we have two types of information that transfer to the log frame, but we can see that external actors are depicted differently. There's this circle, and the external assumptions are we've used a different shape here. And that is something that Food for Peace asks you to do on the TOC checklist. We want, that comes up in formatting, in 10B, right? Elements outside the control of the activity, outcomes produced by other actors, are clearly distinguishable from those affected by the activity and from other types of assumptions. So we want two different shapes for external actors and assumptions, even though they both transfer to the log frame. Okay. We're just catching up with your comments. I'm going to get through a few more slides and then we'll open it up for some more questions. Somebody asked, should risks be visualized differently from assumptions? Food for Peace does not require risks to be depicted in the theory of change diagrams. We talked a little bit about risks earlier, and I'm definitely going to go into the risks that present themselves if your assumptions don't hold. So those risks will be outlined in the theory of change complementary documentation, the narrative. But as far as the diagram goes, Food for Peace doesn't expect those risks to be depicted. Okay, and risks are conditions, right? They're also beyond your control, beyond the control of an activity, but they may negatively impact the achievement of TOC pathways. And again, we're looking for things that will, that are required to achieve. They're positive things. Assumptions are positive things, right? To positively affect the success of a pathway. I'm going to move on pretty quickly to a new poll because we're going to move into now how do we document these assumptions in the TOC narrative / complementary documentation. I want to hear from you. A number of you have used the checklist, and I'd like to know how many of you have provided this type of information in your past TOC narratives. Any or all of it, anything you have provided to support your assumptions, if you could check that box. Great to see the evidence. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, good. This is excellent. And again, all these requests come from the Food for Peace policy and guidance document. So it looks like people are definitely paying attention. I do want to reiterate how we can do this and each of these requirements because it is not coming in consistently. It's great to see that you guys are doing it, but it is, you know, per Food for Peace, this kind of information is not consistently being provided. So we'll jump now on the checklist. We're jumping down to items 20 to 22. We're jumping around a bit because those items on the checklist are all related to assumptions. Okay. And the question here that the person from the remote session posed is directly related to these list items, right? The likelihood of achievement, the risk if it's not realized, the monitoring plan. Here's a sample matrix. This is a tool on the TOPS FSN website that you can use to document your assumptions. Again, Food for Peace doesn't require you to use a matrix, but I find them really easy to display information. It's easier to capture whether we've hit all the criteria than if we were to write a paragraph. In this example, our assumption is that the government will continue to support the expansion of micro-health insurance. Well, the first thing we want to do, which at least half of you said you are doing, is we want the evidence. We want to know why you're sure this will hold true? What's the likelihood? In this case, it's high. And what evidence supports that likelihood? So this group wrote that the microhealth insurance has been piloted in 2 districts. It's planned to expand all over the country as a priority activity. The government of Nepal has already allocated the budget. Succinct. That's key. That's what we heard from Food for Peace the other day. Please make it succinct and give us links. So there's a couple of links to back up that assumption. I'd say, okay, that's some good evidence. That looks like people have done their homework and it's safe to make this assumption. We want to know what is the risk to the activity if the assumption does not hold. And what that means is which outcomes will be affected, right? Will it be like a set of dominoes, and if that assumption fails, will everything topple? In which case that would be high risk. Will it just affect a few outcomes, or is it very low risk? Now, I'm going to say here, if the likelihood of it affecting anything is very low, if it presents low risk to your activity, it's not critical, right? Just get it out of there and unclutter your document. Because if it fails and nothing really changes, it's not a critical assumption. It might still be something you want to pay attention to, but if it's not going to undermine the project, it doesn't need to be there. In this sample, we said medium risk, and we explained why it's medium risk. Households will be deprived from these insurance schemes, but we've got some integrated efforts, right? We're trying to improve household income, develop informal safety nets, so we're expecting households will have some alternative coping strategies. Maybe some advocacy would also start to take place, right, to encourage the government of Nepal to continue to support. How are they going to monitor this? Monitoring is a question that comes up from many of you. How do we monitor something somebody else is doing? We don't have to monitor everything with a survey, right? What we want to know here is how are you going to check in? How are you going to check in to know that the government of Nepal is still actively expanding microhealth insurance? Well, you can stay abreast of their work plans. They're probably publishing, annual reports. Maybe you check in with some key informants twice a year. You attend national health forums. This is the kind of documentation that would support that assumption. We are going to pay attention. So if we know that that assumption is at any risk of failing, we're going to know in advance, right? We're not going to find out abruptly. We're paying attention. There's another sample here. We're running a little bit out of time, or not out of time, but a little behind. So I think I'll let you peruse this example on your own when you have the presentation. Question here, assumptions made in the theory of change. If they don't hold, can it be changed? Yes, absolutely. If an assumption doesn't hold, it must change, right? It's a critical precondition, and that's adaptive management. So absolutely, your theory of change will change, and as I mentioned, there will be some more TOPS workshops in the next year about how to do an annual review and how to actually change your theory of change when conditions are altered or assumptions do not hold. All right, that was a lot on assumptions. Are there any more questions? Okay, if they come up a little bit later, still type them in and we'll get back to you. I'm going to ask you to take a quick poll before we move into the topic of rationale. It's really important to get your input here. And for anyone who is still confused, please write to me directly, and we'll try to remedy that confusion. We'll try to ensure that the guidance is clear so things aren't confusing. But please feel free. If you don't want to type your question in the chat box, you've got emails, reach out. Touch base with your Piece M&E regional advisor. They're a wealth of information. Okay, well, good. I'm glad we could bring a little more clarity to the topic. Let us move on to rationales. And again, we're going to ask you to take a quick poll to try to understand your level of comfort using rationales when you develop Food for Peace theories of change. Okay. It's hard to know when to move forward. Maybe some people feel like not voting. It would be great if you could all kind of cast a vote, because that helps us understand when it's the appropriate time to move on. But I think we've had enough time to answer that short question, so I'm going to move on. These are the questions you posed, and it looks like this is a fairly muddy topic where there's definitely some room for clarity. People really, the clearest question was, I need a better understanding of rationales and how to document them. Rationales per Food for Peace M&E policy and guidance, they help explain underlying logic, right? You don't need them everywhere. You don't need them in between every single causal link, but you place them where the logic might not be obvious to everybody. They provide evidence about why a particular outcome is a necessary precondition to the outcome above. And we typically insert them with just a small reference. Unlike the assumptions, we don't particularly need them to be spelled out because they're more about going, if you don't understand the causal logic, it's more about just going back and having someone help explain why that makes sense. But they definitely have a role in the complementary documentation, the narrative. That's where a lot of information about rationales show up. So how do we know where they belong, right? You say, oh, we don't need them everywhere. Well, we don't need them everywhere because sometimes the links are well established. They're accepted among the development community, right? Some of the examples of things that most in the community accept are on the screen. And in these cases, there's no rationale needed, right? We have some evidence that shows that if we eat nutrient-rich food, we'll have improved nutrition, right? If we adopt some recommended, proven practices that will contribute to increased production, there will be other conditions in place as well. But sometimes the plausibility of that linkage, it's not so clear, right? In the case of the first one, increased access to credit contributes to increased investment in small business enterprise. Well, there's plenty of examples of people gaining access to credit and using it for weddings and dowries and other things that are very necessary in their life. So that's not a very strong, to me, without some support there, it's that needs a rationale to help us understand how that's going to happen. Or control over household finances, right, contributes to increased use of health services. What are women's priorities, right? We have some white literature showing increased decision-making and education leads to improvement in nutrition, but I don't know of any data, and if you have it, send it, showing that if women have improved control over their finances, they will absolutely use it to invest in health services. There may be other things, at play here. We have plentiful examples of the third one where they've got more access to nutrient-rich food, maybe via a kitchen garden or something, but that food is sold, right? It's not consumed. And so the increased access does not contribute to increased consumption. So those are places where you can strengthen the plausibility by inserting a rationale and saying why you expect this to be true. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. But the other case is where there might be some good evidence. That's 2 bullet points there on the mentally stimulating environments and the gender-based violence, right? These are well documented, but they may not be so obvious outside of the health and nutrition sector or those who are very focused on gender. So if a generalist might question the logic, stick in a rationale, right? It's just going to strengthen the plausibility of that linkage. Let's take a look at this example, right? We have increased use of healthcare services, and we're saying the absolute necessary preconditions are that women have increased control over healthcare decisions, that there's increased access to services, an increased number of female providers, and increased knowledge about practices. Now, some people might argue that just the decision-making control, the access to healthcare services, and the knowledge are sufficient. But this partner is stating it is absolutely necessary for us to increase the number of female providers. That is a necessary precondition. What kind of rationale evidence would support that, right? What would we expect to find in the complementary documentation to say this is why this precondition is absolutely necessary? I'm going to ask you to type in your chat box. And again, this could be your own formative research. It could be, it's not always a white paper, right? It's not always a published paper by some academic institution. But what kind of evidence would support that? Good, I see Alice is typing. I could get some other folks chiming in. Great, Katie, thank you. Absolutely. Great example from Alice. Okay, good example coming from Katie. It would be in the form of formative research, right? Maybe you had a project in that area, and your first phase of the project, you were working on all these other things like access to healthcare services and knowledge, but the formative research showed that the main reason women continued to not go to those healthcare centers is because the providers were male. right? And so in this case, the rationale demonstrates why that precondition is absolutely necessary. It's critical, right? And the healthcare center data, yes, Rose. So good points from all. But as we're always trying to distill our theories of change and get it down to necessary and sufficient, that type of rationale shows why that outcome is absolutely necessary. And if I could probably improve this sample, it's really kind of framed as an indicator, but I think the point here is well taken. You guys gave some great examples. Let's look at another one, and this is my goof. I was supposed to move the rationale. If you can move that little rationale right up the pathway so that it's hitting both the arrow coming out of improved knowledge and skills as well as improved access. So the rationale is sitting right on top of those two arrows. It applies to both of them. What kind of evidence might support that linkage? Yeah, okay, we got some people thinking here. Previous project data that says what? Yeah, for the most part, right? If you had some project level or some other evidence showing that when the efforts to increase the capacity to manage SMEs are layered and integrated with this access to savings, men and women elect to use those financial products to invest in small and medium enterprise. Right? But that information needs to be coming at the same time. The information needs to be linked together. That's the whole layering and integration. Otherwise, people might use the savings and financial services to invest in something that is not productive or not what you intend. I'm going to skip the next one. I'll just say briefly that it's an example of when the causal logic may not be obvious to all users, right? This might be common to those who are very familiar with ag and NRM, but it might not be, the effective terracing and drainage maintenance on soil fertility may not be obvious to the general users. So we're going to move along and then try to get back on schedule. What I'd really like to promote here is that you guys use your rationales to demonstrate your secret weapons, right? When you have a very effective implementation strategy, you have something that you do very well and you see great results from it across a number of contexts, or you've conducted pilots in multiple geographic areas, and you're really showing that some way in which you do something results in a particular outcome. You can use a rationale to demonstrate that, right? And you can use the evidence from your project reports and the research, and you enhance the plausibility. This is coming from the outputs to the outcomes, right? So let's say you have a number of project reports and you're showing how this unique design of your permagarden trainings has resulted in a large number of farmers adopting the practice, and it's also resulted in a good spillover for indirect beneficiaries, people who were not even a part of the permagarden trainings. They witnessed the increase in production of their neighbors and so forth. That's a great rationale, right? It's your secret weapon. It's saying, and it convinces me, when I'm looking at that diagram, that if this organization does this, we'll expect to see this particular outcome, right? They've given me some good evidence to say that. That's a good hypothesis. Of course, they'll be monitoring it, but that's a pretty good hypothesis. here's some questions to help you determine if the rationale is necessary. Is the link between the precondition and outcome well established within the development community, and is it common knowledge for a wide variety of practitioners, right? Not just your very specific NRM group or your very specific gender group. So if you can say yes to both of these things, don't stick a rationale in there. But if you say no, if you could say no to either one, a rationale can strengthen your causal logic. And when this piece receives that diagram, they have any questions about, well, why did this, why do they think this will lead to this? They can jump right into the complementary documentation and understand why you believe that causal logic is strong. If you ask yourself the question, is this going to strengthen the argument that this specific intervention that I am promoting is going to lead to a particular outcome, stick a rationale in there. Request from Food for Peace is to make the rationale succinct. Okay, not a huge story, not 3 paragraphs from the project report, a very succinct sentence in the complementary narrative that we'll look at now, and then make links to the sources. Let's just take a look at the bottom matrix. Again, these are sample matrices. They're not required by Food for Peace. Modify them if you want, come up with something else, but here's one way to provide information in the complementary documentation. I've got a little R on the left-hand side. That it makes it very easy for Food for Peace to find which rationale am I talking about, because I've numbered it number 1 in my diagram. And then they come and they read, okay, well, we had some focus groups for the previous project gender analysis. Women are reluctant to attend the health care centers. The majority of providers are male. You've got your citation and link to that gender analysis from your previous project. So in summary, right, the assumptions are highlighting conditions that are important to the success, but outside your control. I think we all got that, right? No internal assumptions. The rationales are helping to explain that underlying logic. You don't need one for every causal linkage in a pathway. And please give them a different color and shape. Make them look different from one another. Make sure you demonstrate them in the key so somebody knows, oh, what is that shape? That's the rationale. All right, we're going to move ahead. Do you have any questions before we jump into the cross-cutting areas where you had numerous questions? That says you most have, oh, okay, never mind, sorry. Any questions, any other questions? Are we all cooking dinner out there, or? Okay, I'll move on ahead. We're going to ask you to please let us know what you think. We had a substantial confusion about rationales a few minutes ago. Could you take this quick poll and let us know how you're feeling right now? Oh, Pauline, I'm sorry. Adrian will help you with that. Sorry that it's difficult to hear. Okay, if there's still some confusion about rationales, please send us your questions, reach out to your Food for Peace regional person. It's really helpful for us to know what is still confusing, because when we understand what's confusing, we can improve the guidance here at TOPS. And I know Food for Peace is very keen to understand where you're confused and how they can help make it more clear. All right, we're going to move on into cross-cutting areas. We're a bit off time. It's been happening repeatedly. There were a number of folks across all of the sessions who had questions on cross-cutting themes. Particularly in this group, there were many, many questions. So I'm going to ask you, let's wait and give Adrienne a minute. We're going to get to the next slide. And, oh, we already are there. Okay. So just let us know how comfortable you are integrating cross-cutting themes in your theory of change. Okay, it'd be really helpful if you guys could weigh in. I know there's 12 folks online. If you, Nancy Peak, you don't need to weigh in, but everybody else, it would be great. Nancy Peak is online, regional advisor for Peace based in Nairobi, just so you all know, and she'll chime in if anything needs to be clarified. But for the rest of you, it's really helpful if we can gauge your level of comfort on cross-cutting themes. If you could just tick the box quickly. All right. Well, I'm going to move on ahead. There were a number of questions that came in about this topic, primarily from those of you attending this session. Like, how do we integrate these? How do we show it in the diagram? How can we weave it in, and so forth? So we're going to try, these were all very similar questions, and we will try to, thanks, Nancy. We did not think you were stealing the results. But we've got 12 people online, and we were hoping to get 11 people to chime in. That's great. Anyway, we also have a question, a very specific question. Can you address gender in both the diagram and narrative, even though you should not repeat anything in the narrative that's laid out in the diagram? The answer is yes. I'm going to get to that, and we definitely expect both gender. I think this is taking not repeat too literally, and so I will explain that. But yes, we want you to actually enhance the understanding of gender in the complementary documentation. And then someone's just plain confused about checklist item 2 about, how to integrate gender. We had some very specific questions about IEE. And this has been a change. This is an example of a very simple language change in the TOC checklist. Because of your questions, we realized, well, yeah, this was a little bit confusing. Your questions relate to, well, how, if we're developing a proposal, how do we take the IEE into consideration? Okay, this is checklist item 26, if anybody's got their printed list out, right? The TOC shows intent to protect or enhance the natural environment. Before these sentences were just one. We have now changed the sentence to say, after the award, all assumptions and issues uncovered by the IEE are incorporated and addressed in the TOC. So, yes, you can't incorporate issues uncovered in the IEE if you haven't conducted it yet when you're sending in a proposal. But you definitely need to show an intent to protect or enhance the natural environment. You're going to do some type of research and inquiry into the environmental state, and that still can be demonstrated in your theory of change pre-award. Right? But we have changed the checklist so that the discussion of IEE comes in after the award. I hope that clarifies things regarding these two questions. So let's look at how to integrate. Right? There's a number of ways that you can integrate these cross-cutting themes. You can use keywords I've become a huge fan of icons recently because they really pop, and I'll show you in a moment some examples. Colors, shades, you can give the key themes, anything related to governance, a different colored border. Beneficiaries doesn't care how you do this, they just care that you do it consistently, right? If you choose to integrate, let's say, the environment with an orange border around your outcomes, make it consistent and make it show up in the key. My tip for success is don't try to demonstrate all the cross-cutting themes in a TOC diagram. Right? It's going to end up looking like a carnival. It's very difficult to follow. Pick what you want to highlight. I know in the current draft RFAs, there's very strong gender and youth themes. Sometimes we see very strong resilience themes. You make that determination based on what you really want to highlight, and that's going to depend on your context assessment, the focus of the RFA and the CSI, your problem analysis. So choose. Maybe you want to focus on, you want to highlight gender, environment, and resilience building, or you're going to really highlight community participation and conflict resolution. So choose what you're going to highlight and then be consistent with your how you highlight it. Here are some examples. How to use keywords, right? Here are sample keywords, highlighting gender, highlighting community participation, highlighting the environment. I'll give you a minute to take a look at that, and then we'll just jump into a sample diagram here. Right? Here, they've been integrated. Right? We have an outcome that talks about bi, male, and female small farmers. Or we're showing how we've integrated the environment over on the far left. Small farmer knowledge and skills on CSA practices improved. We have improved gender equitable extension service delivery. This is also an example of how people have used icons, right? The little gender stamp says, boom, this outcome relates to gender. This outcome relates to the environment. And of course, we have a key to tell us that that's what those icons mean. Here, we've used gender to reflect, we've used orange borders to reflect gender, or green text to reflect the environment. Here we've got an orange border for gender and an icon for environment. So be creative. Everybody's got some type of graphics guru within their organization. Chat with them. Figure out, how can I make these themes pop? I want to show integration. I want to make them pop. What's the best way to do that? Checklist item number 11 is really important, though, because whatever you decide to do, you've got to have a key for all of your coding. And that key needs to be on every single theory of change diagram page. If you've got 3 purposes, the key needs to be on every purpose, and it needs to be on the overall diagram. So don't forget that key. It's critical. And these are just samples. Do what makes sense for you. I loved this question. I don't know who posed it, but I just absolutely loved it. How do you know when they're effectively integrated? Because there's some graphic tricks you could do to make it look integrated, but it's not well thought out. Bravo. That is so true, right? We could go back and just put the little gender stamp on everything and say, yeah, we got gender everywhere. So I want to talk about a few ways you can back up this assertion of integration. Let's see, take a look. Oh, this is a brand new question that came in. Integration. Okay. Oh, okay. Actually, this relates. So this will hopefully answer this person's question too. The argument that there should be a program strategy and not just wording to the outputs and outcomes. Yes, we want to back it up. If we have these, oops, I'm sorry, I'm moving my slide, Adrian. Apologies, folks, we got a little off task here. All right, can we move ahead? Mm-hmm. So this person's question, it also relates to I think the theme of it here is you might be just lathering it with wording in the outputs and outcomes, but if the program strategy doesn't reflect a thorough gender focus, you've got some challenges. So could you go back one slide? Thank you. So I want to demonstrate some ways that I've helped organizations back this up and make sure that it's well thought out. And again, I've done this with matrices. We'll go forward too. These, again, none of the matrices are required by Food for Peace. But if you're slapping gender all over your diagram, one way you can back it up is come up with some kind of project management tool, and you're welcome to use these matrices or modify them, that demonstrates precisely what you mean. We've claimed that these two outcomes have a gender focus. What does that mean? When I was working with this was a consultancy I did with the Sabal project in Nepal, and that gender, the gender lead there wanted to include the gender domains, which I thought was a good idea. First, let's categorize which gender domain, the USAID gender domains, is this influencing? And then specifically, what about gender is addressed in this outcome? Right? So we're talking about equitable participation, but we're also talking in 2.3.1 about providing some child care during the training. With related to 2.3.2, the access to the ag technology, right? We're showing how some specific, now you need to be very specific about what technology, shows promising contributions to decrease in women's time burden. And we're going to adapt those technologies to rural women's needs and constraints. So this helps you be accountable. And I can tell you that it was a fascinating process to watch. This was during the first formal Theory of Change annual review that's been conducted, and it was, again, with the Sabal project. And to watch, everybody run around and put their gender sticker on things, and then the gender lead coming back and saying, wait, now, we got to work this out. What exactly are you doing? You haven't, been talking to me for the past year. We're going to figure something out now. It was wonderful to see the team pull together and say, okay, if I say that this particular outcome deserves a gender icon, I darn well better figure out what I'm doing related to that outcome. So that's one way to keep yourself accountable. Here is another sample matrix related to the environment, where we list, these had the little leaf on the outcome, and the activity discusses how they're going to protect or enhance the natural environment. Succinct, right? Most of this information is probably in your proposal narrative. But if you haven't thought about it and you are using, a graphic to stamp that little environmental leaf on everything, you better back it up and say, okay, this is how we intend to. This is why that outcome deserves an environment stamp. Now, this particular environmental lead elected to. She wanted to know how it would be monitored too, so she put this in on her own, how she should be monitoring it. That may or may not be necessary. I always love knowing how things are monitored, but it's also going to show up in your monitoring plan. So be creative. Develop tools or modify tools you already are using within your organizations to take the theory of change and actually demonstrate somewhere how each of these outcomes are addressing a cross-cutting issue. Sorry, my tongue got a little bit tangled in that last session. Apologies. Are there questions remaining about cross-cutting issues? Okay, as always, please just send them on in if they come to you later. Could we take another quick poll? Let's do this on most of the big topics, the main topics that got many, many, many questions. Okay. Then maybe I guess people have had enough time. Let's jump into pathways. Your questions were, how do we ensure that they're easy to follow and understand? And that is a request on that checklist and in the policy and guidance documents, right? That all elements are portrayed in a logical sequence using directional arrows, showing the causal pathways that follow through from outputs to outcomes and to the goal. That is item number 5. What we don't want to see is this, right? Has that been common among your organizations? I call them flight patterns, because to me they look like all the flights leaving Nairobi and heading other places. Anybody experienced a theory of change that looks similar to this? Yes, yes. When we have in-person sessions, pretty much all hands went up in the room every single time. Okay. Well, there are some tricks, again, to get around this. And we want to make sure that we can tell the story of change. And if we're going to tell the story of change, things need to be a little bit clearer than this, because this is very difficult. I'm going to use Sabal as an example again. And I won't claim that this is perfect, but it was a huge improvement, and it has been, Food for Peace agrees that it's a huge improvement. Some things that this particular diagram has done is the direction of the arrows is clear, right? That might seem like a small point to make, but we need to know which direction arrows are heading, because sometimes this isn't just a straight up linear model. For the most part, they head up, but sometimes arrows head down. It's a system thinking diagram. So if you go back a slide, unlike this, it's not always clear which direction the arrows are heading. Sometimes they have heads, but sometimes they don't. And this has been a common occurrence, I think, is getting diagrams where they're not really sure what's leading to what. The second tip I'll give you, and this is not a requirement, this is just comes from experience, but to help me tell the story of change, I really like to have the preconditions to anything feed out from the top, right? If something is contributing to something else, I bring that arrow out of the top of that diagram as often as possible. And as you can see on this diagram, I try to bring all arrows out of the top, because if they come out at, from all different points of a particular precondition, I get lost. I forget to count arrows. But it's very easy for me to remember that, okay, I'm saying that this contributes to this and this. If the arrows come out of the top at the same point, and then they feed into the bottom of the next outcome. Now, it's not always possible to feed in from the top to the bottom. If you look to the left of your screen, you can see that 1, 1, 2, 2, it just had to graphically kind of feed into the side. So it's not always possible, but that's a helpful trick. use some consistent shapes and colors. We've talked about the key, the requirement number 9 on the checklist a number of times, but that key is going to help readers know what's being represented. And it's also an absolute requirement. You can limit the flight pattern, so it's sort of that tangled confusion, by using linkages. And this is a good, I'm sorry I can't shift to the other side of the diagram, but if you see that little arrow on the very bottom of your screen, 1111, right, which was improved access to savings and other financial services. The key to this diagram indicates that that's a link. Now, this isn't a link to another purpose page. This is an actual link within Purpose 1. That linkage says this is an outcome that exists somewhere else on the page, and that access to finance is contributing greatly to small, medium enterprise establishments in some way. But we also want to show that that access to savings and finance is going to contribute to all these other outcomes. So we use a different kind of line, the dashed line, indicating that the original home for that outcome is somewhere else on the page. But it is also contributing to many, many outcomes on this page. And that avoids those lines shooting across the page and you know, it always happens. You can't get a line going from one place, you know, all the places it needs to go without having a tangled spider web. So linkages can really help. The linkages need to be specific. If you notice, every box is sort of the arrow box. We have 3 red ones, and those indicate linkages to P3. But they're very specific. They say exactly what that linkage is, right? They don't just say linkage to P3. I know in the M&E policy and guidance, the sample diagram in the policy and guidance, it does say, you know, linkage to P3, but that was just illustrative. It wasn't trying to demonstrate this is what you should do. Just put link to P3, link to P1. You need the specific outcome that it's linking to. So that, I don't know if that was confusing or not to folks, and I need to go back to the TOPS guidance as well and see what that looks like. But you want this to be easy for people to use. If you're indicating integration here, in this case a lot of integration to P3, you want people to be able to jump over to P3 and also see that linkage on the P3 page and not have to dig through the entire purpose to figure out where that linkage sits. Just quickly, as another example, we can, the Sabal team decided to use a different color for P1, 2, and 3, and I thought this was just brilliant because the blue is P1, the yellow is P2, and the red is P3. And so at a glance, when you really see this large theory of change purpose page, you can instantly see we've got a lot of linkages, blue linkages, coming in for P1. We've got a lot of linkages coming in, you know, coming or going to P3. And of course, we want to check on the causal logic, but at a glance, it looks as if these are pretty well integrated. These are not siloed purposes. The team thought about how to integrate the various outcomes and get a more layered strategy. Let's do a check on time. 9:19. So we've got 45 minutes, folks. There was a question, I apologize, some of you registered last night and I could not get your questions integrated, but somebody said I'm not clear on number 7. I do want to talk about number 7 on the list. All causal pathways start from an activity output or a condition that is outside the influence of the activity. So an assumed condition, outcomes, produced by external actors, and they connect to the goal. That is pretty wordy, and so maybe we can make that language a little more concise. What that means is that every pathway, and a pathway, in this case, let's look at the bottom left, where we see a whole bunch of outputs there, starting with sanitation products and services, right? So every pathway, I'm getting up to demonstrate. I forgot you guys weren't in the room. The pathway is starting with outputs, right? It's your intervention outputs. Now, if it's another actor who moves just to the right there, the reduced distance to community-based services, see the green banner? That is something produced by another actor, in this case the government of Nepal. So we don't have to list the outputs there because somebody else is producing that outcome. But every single pathway either needs to start with your outputs, what you are doing to grease the wheels of change, or what somebody else is doing, right? If there's an external actor that's going to produce a particular outcome, we don't need the outputs, we just need their outcome. Is that clear? Is that a little bit more clear? And we can work on the language, because I agree that it's a bit hard to follow. Every single time, that's an old comment, okay. Can you go back a slide, Adrian? You can see on P1 here, no, we can't really because we're not at the bottom of the, the image there. But, but you can, yeah. Is that clear to people? Or at least is it clear to the person who was confused about item number 7? Ah, okay, Rose, thank you for that question. It seems like you're contradicting what you said earlier, that not every intervention needs to be included. Let me clarify what I mean. Not every, let's say we're working on improving facilities access to essential supplies. It's sort of near the bottom there. We don't have to include everything we're doing in order to improve facilities access to, that's a bad one to choose. Let's move up, let's see, let's move up to, if you go back to the, let's go back to the blue. I'm sorry, folks, hang on. Oh, increase access to diverse ag inputs, right? So we're in the very far right of the screen. You don't have to list every single intervention that you're doing that might be involved in increasing access inputs, which is what I said earlier. Not every single intervention that you'd list in the DIP needs to be there, but every pathway, and the pathways are the streams that lead from output up to the goal. Every pathway needs to start with an output. Right? Now, that doesn't mean all of your outputs need to be listed, but what we don't want is an outcome that's just floating, and we don't know how it's being produced. Maybe that's the clearest way to say it, right? We don't want a floater. We have some critical outcome that your activity is responsible for producing, not an external actor. It needs to be connected to some box of outputs, right? Either maybe it's one output, maybe it's 3, but something needs to start that change in motion. Is that more clear, Rose? And is it clear to anybody else? Okay, super. Thank you, and I apologize for being confusing. I will say, too, that this sample here, this was before Truth or Peace changed the list item that said include every single output listed in the proposal document. And so that's why these particular samples might look like they've got a jillion outputs, because at that point we were corresponding to the list that wanted everything in there. So we may see a change in the future. Okay, let's see. Timing-wise, 9:30, we've got a half an hour left. I want to move to checklist item 6. This came up in one of the questions here, one of the new questions that came in last night. No precondition leading to an outcome represents a component of the subsequent outcome. Okay, the relation between the two levels of outcome is causal, not definitional. And they give a great example in the checklist about the hand washing, right? That household members wash their hands at critical times is not a precondition for household members apply good health practices. I've taken some examples here, some actual examples from folks I've worked with. Both of these examples do not demonstrate causal logic. This is definitional. Right? Increased exclusive breastfeeding does not cause improved infant and child feeding practices. It's a type of an improved infant and child feeding practice, right? It's not causal. And improved infant and child feeding practices does not cause improved adoption of nutrition and health practices. It's a description of a type of nutrition and health practice that's been adopted. Similarly, over here, increased egg production is not caused by increased crop production and livestock production. Right? Those are types of increased egg production. And if you get confused about this, I always go back to measurement. Talk to your M&E people. How are we going to measure increased egg production? Oh, we're probably going to look at our crop yields, and we're going to look at our livestock production. In the example of the checklist, how are we going to measure if all household members apply good health practices? Well, one of the metrics might be that household members wash their hands at the same time. So if it's a metric, it's descriptive, right? It's not causal. So we're going to blow these up. Don't do this, right? That's what item 6 on the checklist is talking about. Vet your causal logic. We want causes. We want preconditions. Causes in the problem analysis, preconditions in the TOC. But we don't want just subgroups or definitions. And that will really help you unclutter your theories of change. I worked with 13 of you, 13 groups last year, and took your theories of change, your individual theories of change. And this sort of extra baggage, I guess, all these extra definitions were a key part of what was cluttering them up. So, all right. How does this list bridge the gap between generic goals and outputs? How do you guide thinking around behavior? How do we use the strategic thinking to inform activities that are more likely and able to change and not inform activities that are more likely to enable change and not start from activities? I think what you're saying is, how do we, when we're designing a proposal, how do we not just come in thinking about what we're already going to do? Well, these are bigger, broader questions, and I encourage you to go to the top theory of change facilitator guidelines, because this is all about the problem analysis. How do we start with a thorough problem analysis before we even flip it to a theory of change? And when I say problem analysis, I'm not talking about a design workshop where you pull together a problem tree in 1 or 2 days, and then you flip it into your solution tree, and bang, now you've got your theory of change. The problem analysis is the key part. It's iterative. We should go back and forth. We create a problem tree. We vet it with a diverse technical team. We vet it with local, definitely local folks, right? Anybody in the country. We add to it. We decide where we've got gaps. We add, right? We go back and forth. We thoroughly vet the problem tree, the problem analysis before you ever flip it. And I recommend, minimum a couple, 2 to 3 weeks, not working solidly on the problem tree, but paying attention to it, filling gaps, figuring out what we need to know before you ever flip it into the solution tree. And that will answer these questions. So it's a little too big for me to get into today, but reach out, look at the guidance. There are many other good resources there on problem analysis. Many other good resources out there, and we can provide you with those if you need some help. So another big area is formatting. Many folks have questions about the formatting aspect of the theory of change checklist. So let's just hear from you now. Again, do you think you have a good understanding of piece formatting? People are not as inclined to take the polls. Come on, guys. It's just one little button. 7, we're shooting for 11. There's number 8 out there. Click that poll. We routinely getting 7. Maybe 5 of you have dropped off. All right, 8, is there a 9? Good, it seems like there's a little bit better understanding of formatting. I may go through this a little more quickly as we get closer to 10 o'clock. Some of the questions that came in were about wording, okay, and these are related to item number 9, right, on the checklist. All elements are stated as completed, measurable states of being or results, not processes. Okay, Adrian? Okay, all right. So I think what we really need to accentuate here in the examples of wording is that things are stated as results. So we're not looking for something is improved or is going to be improved or will increase. We want a measurable state of being. And if you're looking for help with wording, talk to your M&E people again, right? They're usually pretty good about thinking, how do I state something as that could be measured as a result? As far as where the participle goes, if increased or improved, is at the beginning or the end, Food for Peace doesn't really care where that sits, right? I know in the past, 10 years ago, the push was it always needs to be at the end. It always needs to be at the end. That's not true anymore. It can be at the beginning. It can be at the end. What's important is that it is stated as a completed, state of being, a result, right? Not a process. I think where processes often crop up are in the outputs. So the red words highlight how to make these output statements result statements versus we're going to train health workers on gender awareness, so we're going to be coaching people we're going to coach household decision makers on decision making, right? Just state it as if it's complete. How would you say it's done, right? What did you do? What did you do the last 3 years? Oh, well, we established hand washing stations, right? We trained households. We provided material. So no passive or active verbs. How to capture the TOC single page as a summary, particularly the outputs. This relates to checklist item number 12, right, where Food for Peace asks that you include a single page summary diagram. A word we just removed on Monday, which I think was a bit confusing was it used to say all-inclusive. It used to say capture a TOC single page, it used to say a single page all-inclusive summary diagram. And some folks were sending in, you know, a very big all-inclusive P1, P2, P3, all on one gigantic tangled page. What Food for Peace wants is, okay, let me touch base with you there, Rose, in just a minute. Let me finish this topic. What Food for Peace wants in this summary, it's the first thing they see, right? So a goal, purposes, sub-purposes, you might want to take it down to the next level, but they're going to check the general logic, right? Do these three purposes logically lead to this goal? Is the general logic for the sub-purposes, is that accurate? But they're going to the purpose TOC pages to really understand the logic. So this is the first introduction. This, again, is what Save the Children Sabal did. And related to outputs, you'll see, you saw how many outputs were on those other screens, but things have really been succinctly summarized on this single page diagram. And this project wanted to highlight resilience. They really wanted to say we are focused, resilience is woven throughout. And so on this summary page, they categorized the key outputs as absorptive, adaptive, and transformative, and just listed some of those key outputs. So everything does not need to be on that summary, but you want to give Food for Peace a good idea of what this project is about and your main foci, I guess. Let me go back to Rose's question, and it's not a delay. Questions are wonderful. That's how we all learn. We were specifically asked not to include words such as improved and increased. I'm surprised by that, and I don't know the history of that. I do know that if you included improved and increased with an is, right, like such and such is increased or such and such is improved, that might be problematic. I know there has been some feedback on, I'm so sick of seeing improved and increased and strengthened, like, you know, 40 outcomes with strengthened. To me, we're not writing a novel here, right? I mean, yes, it's nice if you can come up with some other words, but what you really want is a completed state of being that is measurable. And measurable things are often described as increased, improved, reduced, and so forth. I don't know how to actually respond to you know, without having a little more background, Rose. I don't know how to respond to your question. I'm sorry. I don't know, Nancy, if you feel comfortable chiming in here. And if not, that's fine. But maybe we can dig into this a little bit and figure out what the specific problem was with those words being used. I'm going to let the conversation go on in the essence of time, and then we'll see what surfaces in the chat box. Somebody asked, how can we provide text, web links, other references, and not overcrowd the model? All the text and web links and so forth, they belong in the complementary documentation. So if the checklist was unclear, maybe there's just an unfair interpretation. Those text and web links are not expected to be in your diagram. right? They show up in your complementary documentation or your narrative. Here's an example, right? Here's references, right? We've got a reference here, just the rationale box, right? But when we go we just have the assumptions boxes, right? Oops, I'm sorry. My apologies. When we get to the narrative, I'll show you. But all of that information does not belong in your diagram. It belongs in the complementary documentation, all of those web links and so forth. Okay, for consistency, don't we have to limit the number of purposes, 3 to 4 for a goal, as well as the number of sub-purposes? No, there's no guidance on how many purposes or sub-purposes you have. Your problem analysis is going to help you determine how many problems, are consistently contributing to the problem above, and then you flip it and you end up with that number of purposes and outcomes. There's no set number. What I do want you to consider is if you end up with 5, 6, purposes, if your problem analysis determines there are really 5 to 6 key, I call them domains of change, and you can read up on the top literature on that, can you be effective if you address them all? Right? Can you be effective in 5 years? Do you have a budget? Do you have the resources? Can you do everything well? Probably not. And this is where it gets down to really prioritizing what we tackle and determining, using your stakeholder mapping and your assessments and your research, determining who else is tackling various purposes and sub-purposes. But don't prescribe to, okay, we've got to have 3. We can only have 2. That's limiting. That's old thinking. That's like, going back to 1995 or something. Your problem analysis determines how many purposes and sub-purposes and outcomes there are. Some sub-purpose might have 1 intermediate outcome. Some sub-purpose might have 4, right? And everything's not even Steven. All right, I'm going to ask you to take another quick poll, and this is going to be speed poll. Can we all do this in 30 seconds? Can you let us know whether or not you have a better understanding of formatting expectations? And then we'll jump into the complementary documentation, formerly called the narrative. Oh, speed, I love it. 5, right away. Okay, 6, 7, 8. Okay, we've lost a couple, so 6, there we come, 7. All right, you guys are great. We're going to move on to the complementary documentation. Why is the name changed from narrative? Because it's not a narrative, right? It's items, if we move to the checklist and we see item 1415, again, this is what Superpeach really, really wanted us to stress. Does not repeat anything already presented, does not present the problem analysis. We don't want the story of change, right? You often tell that in your proposal narrative. So I think this is a huge, just a great leap forward, simply calling it something else, right? We want more evidence. And I will pause here because, great, Nancy has chimed in. Okay, and yeah, and that was something that was actually also changed from the, that might make, thank you so much, Nancy. That is an item on the, and I failed to mention it, but that was an item formerly on the checklist. Which item was it? But it did say that the use of improved, and okay, it was formerly item number 9. There was a second sentence that said, adjectives that reflect only incremental change like increased, improved, more or less, are avoided and do not appear in the goal or purposes.
recently that's been axed. So that is no longer a part of the checklist, but Nancy's advice is the most, like, work with your M&E advisor. It's the M&E director at Food for Peace took that sentence out because a lot of times the RFAs and the CSIs come in with a goal that has improved and increased, and it seems like a bit of a mixed message. So maybe I was confused about what you were asking, Rose. All right, documentation. Maybe we've just pulled you to death. Oh, great, you're already there. Let's move ahead. Your questions. What does it mean to clearly lay out something, so not to talk about it in the narrative, don't repeat things? I think I've clarified that, right? We don't want the story. We want a lot of evidence. And what I'm going to go over now is what M&E policy and guidance says we need to highlight in the theory of change narrative, right? We want anything we can't easily communicate graphically. And that included those web links and the references, right, that somebody mentioned earlier. We want to convey the degree of certainty that the pathways will, and the diagrams will occur. We do that with information on our rationales. We want to identify conditions that could threaten progress. We do that within our assumptions. So the narrative, now called documentation, it's not standalone. Think of it as an annex to a paper you're writing, right? An annex wouldn't make any sense if it weren't attached to the document because it has all of those references. And that's what the TOC complementary documentation is. We're going to add some details related to external assumptions, details on rationales, details on external actors. We're going to talk about how the activity addresses cross-cutting areas and explain how the activity will result in population-level change. We've looked at this earlier, right? We show a tiny little symbol in our graphic, yet in the narrative, we back it up, right? We back it up with a study or a citation, a link, a simple, succinct statement on why we believe this causal linkage is strong. We'll look at a few more matrices here. Again, want to highlight that there's a 6-page limit for Niger and Burkina RFAs. The 6-page limit resulted from Food for Peace receiving 20, 30, 95 in some case, page theory of change narratives. And that's too much. And they were long, long stories, fully written out paragraphs telling the entire story of change. So that's where this page limit came from. I have confidence it's going to change a little bit, but it's not going to change for Niger or Burkina. The matrices were not widely used yet, but there definitely is, people are finding that these matrices are helpful. They're easy. They make it very easy to reference from a graphic to supporting evidence. Food for Peace has no preference. They don't tell you you must use a matrix, you must write a paragraph. They don't care how you give them the information, as long as you give them the required information and as long as it's easy for them to find, right? If they want to know what your rationales are all about, they can quickly and easily go from the graphic to the complementary documentation. And I want to highlight that any of these matrices that we put up on the website, make them work for you. Alter them. Change the columns. Do whatever you need to do. The point is to get Food for Peace the information that they want when they receive that, all of that complementary documentation. Here's an example. We've looked at it already, so I won't go into detail, but you include an external assumption matrix, and you can organize the information Food for Peace requests in this type of matrix. Here's a sample external actor matrix, right? In item let me jump around here. Item 23 on your checklist. There's a lot of information about external actors. They want to know that you've done your homework and you know who's doing what where. So you could organize this in a paragraph. You can drop it in a matrix, but be sure to explain who are the actors, right? We don't just say somebody else is providing information on safe migration. We say, you know, Ministry of Education, or, you know, we say who that actor is. What is the scale relative to your activity coverage, you know? Or how are you going to collaborate with them? Not a formal collaboration, but checking in, which really relates to the monitoring plan, right? The timing, that's very important. When is an outcome expected? That gets into your layering and your sequencing, right? The sequencing is very important if another actor's outcome is a critical precondition to your outcome. So we need to know when that outcome is expected and when it's required. I'll let you peruse these on your own, but I just want to highlight that if you use the matrices that TOPS offers, don't put your external actors in the assumptions matrix, because the information about assumptions is very different than the information required on external actors. The piece wants to know a lot more about the external actors, right? Just here are a couple specific questions. Does approximate timing mean an actual date, or once a certain precondition is met? I think that really depends. I don't think there's a broad answer. Sometimes you do have an actual date, but sometimes, as I mentioned in sequencing, it's that precondition is necessary by the time, let's say, by the time we finish all of our training on XYZ, and by the time people have access to improved sanitation, the masons are trained, and so forth, we need the external actors' outcome to be complete. So it could mean either. It's just going to depend on your theory of change and where that external actor fits. Is the output, Andrew, hi Andrew, output outcome related to the activity or to the goal of the actor? Do you mean this box on the far left in this matrix? Am I referencing an outcome or output? Yes, okay. Yes, and I'll clarify that. That would come from your theory of change. You have determined that there's an external actor producing a particular outcome or output. You would list that outcome. You know, whatever. We saw some examples earlier, right, at the Ministry of some labor, right, and the safe migration, or in the SABAL we saw some other examples of actors. Does that make sense, Andrew? It's whatever outcome you have assigned to them, or you know that they're okay. Super. Okay. Oh, and here I've got some examples right here. That would have been easier. I'm not going to ask you these questions because we're running a little behind on time, but take a look at that when you have the resources. Ask yourself, if I'm looking at this theory of change, when would these external outcomes be required, right? If you look at improved access to financial services, think about the theory here. Think about the sequencing of these outcomes, and when is it absolutely essential for the financial services to be in place. Item number 16, I think I've stressed it throughout, but I'm going to bring it up again because I know it's been challenging for piece. The links between references in the diagram and details are easy to follow. Your piece reviewers have, you know, they're getting 4 or 5 proposals to review in a couple of weeks. Make it easy for them to follow, right? Make sure that if we're talking about gender, we can quickly go and find that 2.3.1. Or if you've got Rationale 1, it's very easy to find the explanation and web links for Rationale 1 in your complementary documentation. It is the best approach to develop the diagram and pathways and draft the complementary narrative, or is it done simultaneously and in an iterative manner? This question sounds like you were expecting a true narrative, a story of change, which we know is not what Future Peace wants. So my answer to this is it's absolutely simultaneously, because as you are coming up with your assumptions, you're documenting them, right? As you're thinking about your rationales and creating the graphics, you're documenting those rationales. As you are, coming up with information on external actors, you document information about them. So it is simultaneous. But I think this question, it sounds to me like someone was thinking of writing the story of change versus a set of complementary evidence. All right, moving right along here. We just have one more section, sustainability. I know we've only got 4 minutes left. Give you a few minutes here to check in, and let's move on ahead to sustainability. A couple of you asked, how do we incorporate sustainability of an outcome into the TOC, and how to integrate sustainability? Okay, I will be the first to admit we need a lot more graphic examples of this, and I was not able to come up with any in the time, but I did come up with a number of questions and a number of things to pay attention to as we think about sustainability. Remember too that item number 28, which is where the checklist talks about sustainability, it doesn't mean just in your graphic, right? You can talk about sustainability in the complementary documentation. So all of these 25 through 29 are all about both the graphic and the narrative complementary documentation, or both, one or the other. They just want to make sure these things show up. So some suggestions, my thinking on this, and I did vet it with Future Peace this week, but some key areas where sustainability could be demonstrated is the best place for it is in the intervention outputs, right? You show that you're focusing on local service providers. You show that you're linking to local networks. You demonstrate that the direct handouts are limited. Another great way to demonstrate sustainability in the diagram is through feedback loops, and we'll take a look at a couple of those. So when you're coming up with which outputs will help you demonstrate sustainability, there's a set of questions here, and I think I'll ask you to review these on your own. I heavily relied on the recent Tufts study. B. Rogers and colleagues came out with a very interesting study. Many of you, I think, have seen it, calling out capacities, linkages, motivation, resources as key contributors to sustainability. So I framed some of these questions based on those findings, right? Do the outputs you list, and again, when we're trying to get away from that exhaustive list of outputs, are the ones you list, did they demonstrate that you're strengthening individual capacity, right? People will be able to implement what you want them to implement, right? Do they demonstrate that people will have those resources, right? Once all is said and done and you're out, are they going to have the resources they need to adopt and apply new practices? I've only listed income and profits, but some of those could be intangible capacities. It might be some type of social capital or some type of human capital via knowledge. Do your outputs demonstrate how the activity is collaborating or strengthening the capacity of LSPs. Does it demonstrate a sustained source of resources? Some of you have done this really well. You've integrated fee for service, right? You show how, you know, a fee, something that starts out as provided by the project but then ends up being fee for service is great to design. It's motivating the service providers to, you know, continue providing. It's providing them with resources for their own service delivery and so forth. I really apologize that we're barreling through this, and I encourage you to reach out after this webinar and reach out to your regional advisors, Nancy, Chung, Mara, Mordini, Hillary. Reach out to those folks as well. Just a few more here. Does the sequencing of listed outputs demonstrate how responsibility will phase over? You know, as you get to the bottom of the list, it shows that somebody else is going to be providing it when all is said and done. You may start providing a particular service, but some local institution or public or private sector will take over. Motivation. Bea and folks in the TUF study talk a lot about motivation. So we can show in the TOC what's going to motivate service providers, usually financial incentives, right, or in-kind benefits that motivate service providers to continue to provide services. What motivates beneficiaries? Typically, it's some kind of tangible and immediate benefit resulting from adoption. If I have some benefit, I don't need someone to convince me to keep doing it. So if you can demonstrate that, and here's the last piece on feedback loops, right? In this case, a very common one is the income, right? If we're increasing income, that feeds back into a lot of things. This is a very flat, it's not a very detailed sample, but if people do indeed achieve more income, then they will be able to have financial access to quality inputs, provided those inputs are available in the market and so forth. So showing this, I call this self-propelling change, right? If you've got some feedback loops in your diagram, it demonstrates that your higher level outcomes actually come right back down to the bottom and start pushing the change forward from the bottom so that you can start backing out as a project. Alrighty, I think we need to wrap things up. How are y'all? Thanks so much for hanging in there. I know this was a heck of a lot of listening to my voice, and I didn't really know how to get around that. But I thank you all so much for your incredibly detailed and clear questions. That was so helpful to develop the session, and we are available to answer more questions in the coming months. And the resources, we'll send you out the full PowerPoint package. I'm combining the PowerPoints from all three. You can get all the questions from all 4 sessions that'll have the answers in them. It's a big one. It's like it's a huge package, but we'll send that out to you. Adrian has a survey for you. If you see a web link in the bottom left-hand corner, please fill out that survey. It's the only way that we can make our training events better, right? We rely on you to help us learn, how to do things that meet your needs. So please do fill out that evaluation survey and be very honest about what could be improved and added to the next session. So great to see all of you, and we'll be in touch.